She thought it would be the happiest day of her life. The wedding dress was prepared, the vows had been written, the guests were already whispering about the spectacle to come. But when the bride finally stood before the altar, she realized the man waiting for her was not a stranger. He was not a distant noble chosen for politics. He was her father. And what unfolded next would go down as one of the darkest weddings in human history. Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard of bad weddings before. Maybe a groom passes out, maybe an uncle drinks too much and makes a fool of himself. Some people even regret who they marry. But this isn't just a wedding gone wrong. This is a ceremony built on fear, power, and silence. And tonight we're going to unravel not just the story of one bride, but the entire world that allowed such horror to happen. Because here's the chilling truth. This wasn't just about a marriage. It was about control. It was about politics. And it was about how far powerful men were willing to go when no one dared to say no. To understand why this nightmare wedding happened, we have to step back into her world. This was a time when marriages weren't about love. They were about property, alliances, bloodlines. A daughter wasn't seen as a person with dreams. She was an asset, traded, promised, or forced wherever it best served her family's power. And religion, instead of protecting the weak, it often gave a sacred blessing to the very practices that destroyed them. When scripture was quoted, it wasn't always for salvation, it was for justification. So imagine being born into that kind of society. Imagine being a young girl, raised to believe her worth was tied only to who she could be married off to. Now imagine realizing your groom would not be a stranger, not even a distant cousin, but your own father. Now I don't know about you, but I'd bet good money that Hallmark doesn't make a card that says, "Congrats on marrying your dad." Not exactly the kind of thing you put on the mantle, is it? This wasn't just a twisted personal decision, it was political theater. You see, for the father, marrying his daughter wasn't about love or lust alone, it was about power. By binding her to him, he controlled her inheritance, he controlled alliances, and he silenced anyone who might challenge his authority. Think about it. In a world where bloodlines were everything, this marriage ensured that no rival family could lay claim to her. It was a cruel but effective way to keep wealth and power locked in his own hands. And what about the bride? She had no say, no voice. Her wedding day wasn't the beginning of a new chapter. It was the end of her freedom. Now, here's the part that should chill you the most. This didn't happen in secret. There were guests, witnesses, priests. They all stood there and watched as a father placed a ring on his daughter's hand. Some whispered, some looked away, but most stayed silent. And that silence is what makes this story so horrifying. Because silence is complicity, and in that church, or castle hall, or wherever it took place, every silent witness helped legitimize the nightmare. You ever been to a wedding where you really didn't want to speak up during the "does anyone object" part? Well, this was definitely one of those weddings. Only here, speaking up wasn't just awkward, it could cost you your life. Now, we'll never know exactly what went through her mind. History rarely recorded the feelings of women in these positions, but we can imagine. The dread as she was dressed in garments meant for celebration. The sound of guests gathering, perhaps whispering, perhaps mocking. The moment she looked up at the man she once called father and realized there was no escape. Fear, humiliation, despair, emotions so heavy that they would stain not just her wedding day, but the rest of her life. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside her, a spark of defiance. The hope that history would remember her not as a willing bride, but as a victim of power unchecked. And here's where we pause, because the wedding was only the beginning. If you thought the vows were disturbing, what came next would be worse. The so-called wedding night, the public rumors, the scandal that echoed far beyond the walls where it happened. But that's where Act 2 begins. Because once the vows were spoken, the question wasn't just, How could this happen? The question became, what horrors followed after? So brace yourself. Because in Act 2, we step inside the wedding itself. And trust me, you haven't heard the darkest part yet. You've heard of weddings meant to unite kingdoms or to cement alliances. But what if the wedding itself was a crime against nature, against God, and against every human instinct of morality? This was not a tale whispered in myths, but a historical reality, where a young woman was forced to become not just a bride, but the bride of her own father. The setting was deceptively ordinary, a court buzzing with anticipation. Weddings in this age were often political, strategies of power disguised in lace and vows. Yet when the announcement spread that a father was to marry his own daughter, the collective gasp was palpable. Imagine being a servant in the palace halls, overhearing the whispers. Surely we've misunderstood the proclamation. No, the words are clear. His daughter is to be his wife. The court's silence turned to mutters. The clergy debated furiously. Was this even legal? Canon law forbade such a union. Scripture condemned it outright. Yet in an era where kings and lords bent laws to their desires, morality was negotiable. And so the impossible became inevitable. You can almost picture one poor scribe, tasked with writing the marriage record, pausing with his quill mid-air and muttering, "How exactly do I phrase this without going straight to hell?" Now let's pause on the bride herself. We rarely hear her voice. History is written by the victors, by the powerful, and she was neither. She was young, perhaps still in the flush of adolescence when girlhood had only just slipped into womanhood. To her, marriage should have symbolized a future, children, security, maybe even love. Instead, she faced the grotesque parody of a wedding, standing beside her father, the man meant to protect her, not possess her. Was she terrified, resigned, or so conditioned by duty that her own horror felt muted? We don't know, but we can imagine. And it is in that imagining that the cruelty of her situation becomes real to us. And yet, her suffering didn't end at the wedding vows, it only began. Because what followed that ceremony would leave scars that reached far beyond her own life. Picture the wedding itself, the chapel adorned with flowers meant to signify purity, now masking a union that was anything but. Priests stood rigid, their hands trembling as they recited words of blessing over what they privately knew was blasphemy. The guests? Oh, they attended. But attendance does not mean approval. Some came out of duty, others out of fear, and still others, perhaps morbid curiosity. You can almost see them leaning in, whispering behind jeweled fans. How will history remember this day? In medieval and Renaissance courts, spectacle often outweighed morality. Think of Lucrezia Borgia, accused, rightly or wrongly, of shocking scandals with her father and brother. Whether true or exaggerated, such stories revealed how power corrupted not just politics, but intimacy itself. And this wedding? It was the ultimate corruption. The moment came. The priest asked the traditional question, "Do you, sir, take this woman?" The father said yes, and then, turning to his daughter, "Do you take this man?" What could she say? Refusal meant disgrace, exile, perhaps death. Acceptance meant living a nightmare. She whispered yes, and with that single word, the fate of her life was sealed. Somewhere, Cupid must have thrown down his bow and shouted, "Nope, I'm out." No wedding ended without a banquet. Long tables groaned with roasted meats, candied fruits, and goblets of spiced wine. Music played, but the cheer was forced. Imagine the bride seated beside her father, every eye in the hall darting between them, guests choking down their discomfort with every bite. The laughter was hollow, the toasts awkward. It was, in essence, a carnival of hypocrisy. And yet, even amidst the revelry, some whispered, "If this is how the wedding begins, what horrors will the marriage bring?" Here, history becomes its most chilling, for all weddings culminated in the wedding night. It was not just custom, it was proof. The union had to be consummated. But imagine, her walking down a corridor lit with torches, her steps dragging, her pulse racing with dread, the chamber door closing behind her. Was she left trembling, staring at her father across the marriage bed? Did she pray silently for deliverance, or did she resign herself to fate? And here lies the most terrifying truth. What happened that night was not whispered in rumor. It was enforced by ritual, because failing to consummate could void to marriage, and the father would not risk scandal. When dawn broke, the household knew. Servants exchanged glances, the court buzzed with gossip, and yet no one dared speak aloud what they all understood. The bride was no longer simply his daughter, she was now his wife in the fullest, most horrifying sense. From that point forward, she became a prisoner of circumstance. Every dinner, every outing, every public appearance, she carried the invisible chains of that wedding band. Her identity, daughter, wife, victim, was fractured beyond repair. But this was not just her tragedy. It reflected the disease at the heart of power. In a society where kings could declare wars with a signature or execute rivals with a whisper, why wouldn't one also claim his own daughter? When unchecked power meets unchecked desire, the result is history's darkest scandals. And the ripple effects? Other nobles emboldened by such acts, clergy corrupted by silence, entire generations scarred by the knowledge that law and morality bent to the will of the powerful. The bride's suffering was only one part of the story, because such unions rarely ended quietly. They often sparked rebellion, bloodshed, or divine retribution. And in this case, the ending was just as shocking as the wedding itself. In Act 3, we'll uncover what happened after this infamous marriage, the betrayals, the downfall, and the grim fate that awaited those who believed they could bend even family to their will. They thought the vows were the end, but in history's darkest scandals, the vows are never the end. They are only the beginning of a downfall that no crown, no wealth, and no force could prevent. At first, the marriage was wrapped in silence. Court scribes recorded it. Priests mumbled blessings. And the household went on with its daily routines. But whispers have wings. One noble tells another over a goblet of wine. A servant slips a rumor into the marketplace. A merchant repeats it on the road. Soon, the scandal spreads beyond the palace walls. Did you hear? A man has married his own daughter. Shock turned to outrage, outrage to scandal, and scandal in history is more dangerous than armies. Honestly, gossip in medieval courts spread faster than memes do today. Imagine if TikTok existed back then. This story would have broken the app in a single night. The greatest force against the marriage was not the people, it was the church. Canon law forbade incestuous unions. Scripture thundered against them. The Pope himself could not ignore it. To do so would be to unravel the very moral authority of Christendom. So emissaries were dispatched. Letters flew back and forth. Some clergy called for annulment. Others demanded excommunication. A few, fearful of the father's wrath, chose silence. But silence could not contain it. The more the church resisted, the more the story spread. And here's the chilling twist. Some historians believe the father believed he was above God himself. And when men believe that, history always takes a darker turn. While the world debated, the bride lived her nightmare daily. Her body no longer her own, her name tainted, her dignity erased. And worse, pregnancy was inevitable. A daughter forced to bear her father's child. The grotesque reality of a lineage turned inward, twisted upon itself. We don't know if she ever cried out for help, or if she learned the cruel truth that in courts of power, women's voices carried less weight than whispers of gold. Imagine being her. Every glance a judgment, every silence a condemnation, every day a reminder that her fate was sealed not by God, but by her own blood. The scandal soon moved from whispers to resistance. Nobles began to plot. For if a man could marry his daughter, what could he not do? Could he take their wives, their daughters, their inheritances? Fear turned to anger, anger to plotting, and behind the veil of loyalty, rebellion stirred. One chronicler described it as the spark that lit the kindling of war. Because let's be honest, if your king is marrying his daughter, you're probably thinking, this guy's not fit to run a tavern, let alone a kingdom. Here, the story splinters depending on the historical version told. In one account, the church finally stepped in, declaring the marriage null and void, condemning it as an abomination. The father resisted, but political pressure forced his hand. In another version, rebellion toppled him. Nobles seized his lands, and he died disgraced. And in yet another, the bride herself disappeared from records. Whether by exile, by death, or by her own desperate escape, no one can say. Her name fades into silence, swallowed by history. But here is the inescapable truth. Whether undone by church, rebellion, or fate itself, such a marriage could never survive. Power bends the law, yes, but it cannot bend the human soul. The tale did not vanish with their deaths, it echoed. Priests used it in sermons as a warning, chroniclers recorded it as scandal, and generations repeated it as a story of what happens when power corrupts absolutely. It became more than gossip, it became a parable of lust, of arrogance, of power's decay. Because here's the hidden truth. People in the medieval world were not numb to Mora, Blighty. They feared sin, they feared damnation, and this marriage was not just a scandal, it was a glimpse of hell on earth. Centuries later, the story still resonates, not because it is rare. Sadly, history is full of coerced marriages, forced unions, and abuse of daughters by fathers. What makes this story infamous is its audacity. It forces us to confront questions we would rather not ask. How much suffering can power justify? How far can law bend before it breaks? And how many victims remain voiceless, buried not in graves, but in silence? And maybe the darkest truth is this. History does not stay buried. Its patterns repeat. The faces change, the crowns change. But the abuses of power, they always return in new forms. So what happened to the bride who was forced to marry her father? History leaves us with fragments, with whispers, with half-truths. But maybe that is the point. Her story is not simply hers. It is the story of every victim silenced by power, every scandal buried under archives, every name erased because it was too uncomfortable to remember. And by telling it today, we restore not just her memory, but the warning she represents. Because in the end, history is not just a record of the past, it is a mirror of the present. And if we dare look closely enough, we may find that the darkest wedding in history was not just theirs, but a reflection of what humanity is still capable of today. If you found this story as haunting as we did, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of scandal, crime, and the dark underbelly of history. And tell me in the comments, what do you think was the worst fate here? The bride, the father, or the legacy itself? The court had never known silence like this. Once a bustling hub of whispered schemes and lavish intrigue, the corridors now echoed with unease. Nobles who had pledged loyalty began to vanish from council meetings, their seats conspicuously empty. Letters from foreign powers arrived, their words dripping with both concern and thinly veiled. In mockery, the scandal, father marrying his own daughter, had spread like wildfire, igniting fear, disgust, and opportunity in equal measure. The bride, once a mere pawn draped in silk, had become something far more dangerous. Courtiers whispered that she could be used to rally opposition forces, a symbol of the king's moral corruption and vulnerability. Her mere presence in the palace seemed to fracture loyalties. Alliances built over decades began to crumble overnight, and the king could feel the walls of his dominion weakening. Late one evening, the father, once confident, now haunted, stood at his balcony overlooking the city. He saw the banners of disloyal nobles fluttering in the night wind, and he realized a chilling truth. The armies he trusted could not save him. His throne was under siege, not by enemies across the borders, but by the very court he had built and the daughter he had betrayed. The king's most loyal advisors turn against him. In his mind, he knows the most dangerous weapon is no sword or army. It is the daughter whose innocence he has destroyed. Rebellion ignited like wildfire. From the shadows of the castle to the far reaches of the kingdom, insurgents moved with precision. Courtiers who had once bowed to the king's will now plotted his downfall. The church, never silent in the face of moral transgression, delivered its severest condemnation yet, declaring the marriage heretical and the daughter a victim of sacrilege. Enemies of the throne seized the opportunity with ruthless cunning. "How can a man who marries his own daughter be trusted to rule?" they cried as the populace recoiled in horror. The scandal was weaponized at every turn. Sermons, pamphlets, and whispered rumors became instruments of rebellion. Caught between loyalty and survival, the bride faced a harrowing choice: stand by the man who had defiled her life, or abandon him to the wrath of history. Each glance from her father was a reminder of power, control, and terror. Each whisper from his enemies was a call for justice, vengeance, and liberation. Amidst the tension, a rare moment of dark humor flickered, a grim aside. Imagine family dinners after this. Who takes the head of the table? Father? Husband? Trick question, it's the same person. For a heartbeat, the absurdity cuts through the terror. Then, the weight of reality returns. Whispers of execution began to circulate. The king, now surrounded by enemies within and without, could hear the drums of revolt approaching his gates. The bride's future hung in the balance, and every decision she made could tip the scales toward freedom or doom. The palace is stormed, the king's enemies close in, and the daughter's choice becomes the fulcrum of history. The end came swiftly. The throne, once a symbol of unyielding power, crumbled beneath the weight of scandal, betrayal, and divine judgment. Accounts vary. Some say the father was executed, others that he died in exile, shunned by allies and reviled by history. But the result was the same. The legacy of his reign was irrevocably tainted. As for the bride, her name faded from chronicles. In the official records, she is often reduced to a footnote, a cautionary tale of corruption, obedience, and victimhood. Yet in folklore, her story endured. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of the curse that had plagued her bloodline: famine, madness, disease, divine retribution for the union that defied nature itself. Historians remember the father as a tyrant, a ruler undone by hubris and moral corruption. But the daughter remains the ghost of the narrative, haunting the corridors of history as a reminder of innocence violated and voices silenced. The tale leaves a chilling resonance. Unchecked power, familial betrayal, and societal complicity can create horrors that linger far beyond the lifetime of their perpetrators. The bride's name may be lost, but her story remains, a testament that even in history's darkest corners, the victims cry out to be remembered.